In a peaceful African village surrounded by green hills and dusty roads lived a man named Jabari and his wife Amara. People believed they had a beautiful life. Jabari owned a successful cattle business and wore expensive clothes that made others admire him. Amara was different. She was simple, kind, quiet. She spent her days cooking, cleaning, helping neighbors, and supporting her husband in every way she could. Every morning she woke before sunrise to prepare his meals. Every evening she waited for him with a smile. She loved him with all her heart. But there was something nobody knew. Jabari had started changing. Slowly. Quietly. He had become obsessed with status and appearance. And deep inside his heart, he had begun feeling ashamed of his own wife. One afternoon Jabari attended a gathering with wealthy friends. Their wives wore expensive dresses and jewelry. They laughed loudly while taking pictures. Amara stood quietly beside him wearing a simple traditional dress she had sewn herself. One of Jabari's friends smiled and said, "Your wife looks very humble." The words weren't meant to be cruel. But Jabari felt embarrassed. Suddenly he looked at Amara differently. On the way home he stayed silent. Then finally spoke. "You should change the way you dress." Amara looked confused. "What do you mean?" Jabari sighed. "You look too simple." Amara's smile slowly disappeared. Because sometimes pain doesn't come from strangers. It comes from the person whose opinion matters most. Days passed. Jabari's attitude continued changing. When guests visited, he interrupted Amara while she spoke. When she laughed, he looked annoyed. Sometimes he ignored her completely. Small moments. Small humiliations. But pain grows when repeated enough times. One evening Amara prepared Jabari's favorite meal. She smiled while placing food on the table. "I made your favorite." Jabari barely looked up. Then quietly said, "You don't have to try so hard." Amara froze. Her hands slowly lowered. Because she wasn't trying to impress him. She was simply trying to love him. That night Amara sat outside alone beneath the stars. Cool wind moved gently through the trees. She stared toward the sky while tears rolled slowly down her face. She thought about the man she married. The man who once called her beautiful. The man who once held her hand proudly. What happened? What changed? Was she no longer enough? Inside the house Jabari laughed while watching television. Completely unaware of the tears outside. Because sometimes people slowly break hearts without realizing it. The next morning Amara went to the village market. As she carried vegetables home, a man accidentally bumped into her. "Oh, I'm sorry." Amara looked up. His name was Kellen. A respected teacher from a nearby town. He smiled kindly. Then noticed sadness in her eyes. "Are you okay?" Amara forced a smile. "Yes." But Kellen looked at her for a moment longer. Because sometimes people notice pain even when you hide it. And neither of them knew. That small moment was about to change everything. Days passed, but Amara couldn't stop thinking about the man she met at the market. Not because he was handsome. Not because he said anything extraordinary. But because he noticed something. Her sadness. Something her own husband had stopped seeing long ago. A few days later she returned to the village market again. As she walked between colorful fabrics and fruit stands, she suddenly heard a voice behind her. "Amara." She turned around. Kellen stood there smiling. "I didn't expect to see you again." Amara smiled politely. Neither of them noticed how natural that smile looked. Because lately, smiling had become difficult. Kellen pointed toward the vegetables in her hands. "Looks heavy." Before she could answer, he gently carried one of the bags. Amara laughed softly. "No, I can carry it." Kellen smiled. Sometimes people deserve help too. For a moment Amara looked at him silently. Because nobody had said something kind like that to her in a very long time. That evening Amara returned home smiling slightly. For the first time in weeks her heart felt lighter. Jabari sat inside looking at his phone. Without looking up, he asked, "You're late." Amara stopped. "I went to the market." Jabari nodded without interest. No smile. No questions. "No, how was your day?" "Nothing." Amara looked at him quietly. Because once upon a time Jabari would ask about everything. Now silence had become normal. She placed food on the table and sat beside him. But even sitting close together felt like sitting worlds apart. A week later Amara woke up excited. She wore her favorite dress. Prepared special food. Decorated the table. Because that day was important. Their wedding anniversary. Years ago Jabari used to bring flowers. He used to hold her hand. He used to tell her she was beautiful. Amara waited all day. Evening arrived. Then night. Finally Jabari entered the house. He looked tired. Amara smiled. "Do you remember what today is?" Jabari looked confused. "What?" Silence. Amara stared at him. Then smiled weakly. "Nothing." Because sometimes forgetting a date hurts less than forgetting a person. The next afternoon Amara sat beneath a tree near the village river. Quiet wind moved through the grass. Suddenly a voice interrupted her thoughts. "You look sad again." Amara looked up. Kellen smiled and sat nearby. For a while neither spoke. Then Kellen looked toward the river. "You know something?" Amara looked at him. He smiled gently. People often spend too much time searching for valuable things. Then looked directly into her eyes. While ignoring the treasure already beside them. Amara froze. No one had looked at her like that for years. Not with admiration. Not with respect. Not with kindness. And deep inside, something forgotten began waking up. That night Amara stood in front of a mirror. For a long moment she simply stared. She looked at her face. Her eyes. Her smile. Then remembered Jabari's words. "You look too simple." Years ago those words hurt deeply. Tonight they felt different. Because suddenly she asked herself something. What if I was never the problem? Slowly Amara smiled. Not for Jabari. Not for Kellen. For herself. And somewhere inside her heart, a quiet change had started. Days passed, and something inside Amara slowly changed. She started waking up earlier. Not to please Jabari. Not to impress anyone. For herself. She reorganized her small sewing space, cleaned the shelves, arranged colorful fabrics, and began designing clothes again. Years ago, before marriage, creating dresses had been her dream. But somewhere between responsibilities and trying to become the perfect wife, she had quietly buried it. Now those forgotten dreams were returning. One morning she looked at her reflection and smiled. Not because she suddenly looked different. But because for the first time in years, she felt different. That evening Jabari entered the house expecting the usual silence. But instead he heard music. Soft music. He walked toward the room and stopped. Amara sat beside fabrics, smiling while sketching clothing designs. Jabari frowned slightly. What are you doing? Amara looked up. Oh, just working on some ideas. Jabari looked confused. For weeks she had seemed quiet and sad. Now suddenly, she looked lighter. Happier. And strangely, that bothered him. Because some people only notice your value after they stop controlling your happiness. A few days later Amara attended a community gathering. She wore a dress she designed herself. Simple. Elegant. Beautiful. People immediately noticed. Women gathered around her smiling. Amara, you made this. It's beautiful. You look amazing. Amara smiled shyly. Across the crowd, Jabari watched silently. Then something unexpected happened. Kellen approached. He smiled warmly. You look wonderful. Amara looked surprised. Thank you. Jabari's face changed instantly. Because in all the years they were married, he couldn't remember the last time he complimented his own wife. That night Jabari sat alone thinking. He remembered Kellen smiling at Amara. He remembered people praising her. He remembered her laughing. Laughing. A sound he hadn't heard from her in months. Something felt strange inside him. Uncomfortable. Heavy. Jealousy. But he quickly pushed the thought away. Why should I care? He whispered. Yet deep down he already knew the answer. Because for the first time, someone else was appreciating what he had ignored. Later that evening Amara sat outside watching the sunset. Jabari walked toward her slowly. Normally she would smile immediately. Normally she would ask about his day. Normally she would try. But tonight she simply looked at the sky. Peacefully. Jabari sat beside her. Silence filled the space between them. Then he finally asked, Are you happy? Amara looked at him quietly. Then smiled softly. Yes. Just one word. But somehow, it felt like the beginning of something ending. Weeks passed. Amara's small dress design slowly became popular in the village. Women started visiting her home. Some asked for custom dresses. Some asked for advice. Others simply wanted to sit with her. The once quiet woman who spent her days trying to earn love had become someone people naturally admired. Laughter slowly returned to her life. Confidence returned to her eyes. And without realizing it, Amara had stopped waiting for Jabari's attention. One afternoon Jabari arrived home and saw several women leaving his house smiling. He looked confused. What happened here? One woman laughed. Your wife is very talented. Jabari stood still. Talented. For years he never even asked about her dreams. And suddenly everyone else was seeing something he never noticed. The next evening Amara attended another village gathering. Soft music played while people laughed and danced. Across the crowd Jabari noticed Amara talking with Kellen. She was smiling. Not a polite smile. Not a forced smile. A real smile. Bright. Warm. Alive. For a moment Jabari froze. Because suddenly he remembered something painful. Years ago, she used to smile like that with him. He stood there staring silently. And for the first time, he wondered if he was watching someone slowly walk away. That night Jabari couldn't sleep. He lay staring at the ceiling. Kellen's face kept appearing in his mind. Amara's laughter repeated inside his head. Then another thought entered his mind. What if she stops loving me? The idea felt impossible. Amara had always stayed. Always cared. Always waited. But now, for the first time, he wasn't sure. And fear slowly entered his heart. Because people often think love will always remain there waiting. Until one day they realize. Nothing stays forever when ignored. The next morning Jabari found Amara sitting outside sewing a dress. He sat beside her awkwardly. Amara. She looked up. Yes. Jabari hesitated. Then asked. Have you been spending time with Kellen? Amara looked surprised. Then smiled slightly. Yes. Silence. Jabari looked away. People are talking. Amara stared at him quietly. Then finally spoke. People also talked when you embarrassed me. Jabari froze. Her words hit him harder than shouting ever could. Because deep inside, he knew she was right. That evening Jabari stood alone watching Amara from a distance. She sat outside under the sunset sketching new designs. Peaceful. Happy. Strong. And suddenly he saw something he hadn't seen before. Not a simple woman. Not someone embarrassing. Not someone ordinary. He saw the woman who stayed beside him through everything. The woman who loved him when nobody else did. The woman he slowly pushed away. And for the first time, Jabari felt regret. Real regret. Because sometimes people realize someone's value only after they start losing them. A month later the village prepared for its biggest annual celebration. Music echoed through the streets. Colorful decorations hung between houses. People laughed and gathered together. Amara had also received an invitation. That evening she stood in front of a mirror wearing one of her own handmade dresses. Elegant. Beautiful. Confident. Jabari stood silently near the doorway. For a moment he couldn't speak. Because the woman standing in front of him looked like someone completely different. Not because her face changed. Not because her clothes changed. Because her spirit had changed. Jabari forced a small smile. You look nice. Amara looked at him. Years ago those words would have made her heart race. Tonight, she simply smiled politely. Thank you. Because some compliments arrive after the damage is already done. The festival was alive with music and dancing. Children ran between people laughing. Villagers celebrated happily. Jabari stood beside a group of men talking. But his eyes kept searching for Amara. Then he saw her. Across the crowd. Laughing. Smiling. Talking with Kellen. And suddenly Jabari felt something strange. Invisible. For years Amara had followed him everywhere. Waited for him. Watched him. Loved him. Now she wasn't even looking at him. For the first time in their marriage. Jabari felt what loneliness tasted like. Later that evening Jabari finally walked toward Amara. Can we talk? Amara looked at him quietly. Then nodded. They walked away from the crowd. For a few moments neither spoke. Then Jabari looked down. I made mistakes. Silence. I should have treated you better. Amara looked at him carefully. Years ago she would have cried hearing those words. But tonight, her eyes remained calm. Then softly she asked, Jabari, would you still feel this way if nobody else noticed me? Jabari froze. Because deep down, he already knew the answer. Music suddenly grew louder nearby. People started gathering together. Jabari and Amara turned around. In the middle of the crowd stood Kellen. Holding flowers. Holding a small ring box. Jabari's eyes widened. Silence spread through the crowd. Kellen slowly walked toward Amara. Then knelt down. Everyone stared. Jabari couldn't breathe. Kellen looked up at her. Amara. His voice was calm. You deserve someone who sees your worth every day. He opened the box. Will you give me a chance to love you the way you deserve? Jabari felt his words stop. Because the wife he was once embarrassed by was now the woman another man proudly wanted forever. Amara looked at Kellen. Then looked toward Jabari. Tears slowly filled Jabari's eyes. Not because he lost a wife. Because he finally understood what he had lost. Years of love. Years of loyalty. Years of someone who only wanted to be appreciated. Amara smiled softly. Then spoke. Never ignore someone who gives you their whole heart. Jabari lowered his head. Because sometimes life gives people treasure. And they only realize its value after letting it go. As the celebration continued around them, Jabari stood alone. Watching. Regretting. Learning a lesson that arrived too late.